Pick me up, take me out, fuck me up.
In my late 20s, my mailbox became Grand Central Station, flooded with friends simultaneously announcing their I do's. We're having a baby, or even we're having another baby. It was painfully apparent I was tragically behind. I was slowly navigating through the collateral damage of an 8-year relationship with a raging alcoholic. I had become hostage, locking myself in my bathroom to avoid drunken arguments or his attempts at physical intimacy that ended with him passing out. This was not love. I left our home and all of its belongings to rebuild. I would not be a victim. Shortly after leaving, I watched both my grandparents make their grand departures from this world a few months apart. Experiencing the lowest of lows, I withdrew further from my friends and family. Food had become the love in my life, a temporary emotional refuge of sorts. It was always there, and I didn't hesitate to answer its midnight call. Uncomfortable in my skin, I ate my way to being classified as morbidly obese, 320 pounds to be exact. I was an epic failure, a Lifetime Channel movie in the making. I took up residence in my grandparents' home and scheduled Souls Harbor to come pick up a donation of their belongings. I knew of Souls Harbor as the thrift store in Dallas. I would later find out it was also a homeless shelter for men struggling with addiction. Brian was sent to pick up my donation that evening. He was a handsome, clean-shaven, slender but toned man. As he steadily approached the door, our eyes locked for a brief second, and a strange calmness washed over me. Our interaction was brief, but I knew there was something special about this man. I slept on it heavily that night and awoke the next morning, still haunted by the same strong impulse. I decided to reach out to him. I had nothing to lose. What's the worst that could happen? I sat for what felt like eternity before hitting send. Hi, is this Brian? It is. Who is this? This is Tami. I was your last pickup last night. This is out of the normal for me, and you may think I'm crazy, but would you like to have coffee or a drink sometime? I remember perfectly who you are, and would love to have coffee sometime. The first night we hung out, we spent 5 hours on my sofa, listening to an eclectic playlist that consisted of everything from The Cure to Fountains of Wayne. We talked about our religious beliefs, or lack thereof, his passion for soccer and running, and my obsession with music. Brian spoke about his past openly, alluding to the fact that he was a recovering alcoholic, and I shared my recent experience. Before Brian left that night, I asked if he needed anything. He replied by asking me for a kiss. I was completely thrown by the question. Was he blind? Who wants to kiss a fat girl? Like a fish out of water, I hadn't kissed another man in quite some time. Nonetheless, I obliged. That kiss would be our first and only. I wasn't at a place where dating was a legitimate option. I was learning to love myself again. We were both in delicate stages, healing from opposite sides of addiction. What we both needed was a friend. Brian and I continued to stay in touch, checking in with each other from time to time. One afternoon, Brian asked if I had ever considered renting out one of my rooms. I had never thought of it, but maybe this house needed some new energy. Maybe this was my opportunity at redemption, to save someone that beat the disease that dominated my life. Brian moved in as my roommate and began working towards his personal training certification. Once completed, I hired him to train me back to better health. In the beginning, I could barely run for 20 seconds without gasping for air. This was going to be a long road for the both of us. I am sure Brian began to have second thoughts when I threw myself onto a neighbor's lawn in a dramatic attempt to derail my training. Others would have belled, but not him. In less than a year, I lost 100 pounds. Brian had taken on several new clients and just finished running his first ultramarathon. We grew closer. Whether it was our bi-weekly fajita night at La Hacienda Ranch or slumming with our snuggies watching Starship Troopers, We were always laughing freely like children. In a moment of bravery or delusion, I asked Brian to train me for the Big D half marathon. He agreed proudly without hesitation. I wasn't a born runner, but I was hell-bent on becoming one. In a 6-month period, Brian and I logged over 400 training miles. I was unstoppable. Running was my therapy and helped me take back ownership of my life. I was on fire. Every mile, my confidence and stride grew. I had become one of those crazy people who ran in the pouring rain, freezing sleet, or that reliable Texas heat. I loved every minute of it. My life had become oddly balanced, but not for long. It was a bitterly cold January morning when something didn't feel right with my body. When I mentioned it to Brian, he joked about me being pregnant. It might have been funny if I hadn't been dating someone a few weeks prior. I played along and purchased a 3-pack pregnancy test. As expected, that test came back negative. I was a little ahead of the test. 2 weeks later, that test would come back positive. Panic consumed me. How does this happen? We took every possible precaution. Brian was my first call. It is one of the only times a guy could get that kind of life-altering phone call and not lose his shit because it wasn't his. I cried gutturally on the phone as uncertainty and disbelief overwhelmed me. Brian was with me later that night as I made the "we need to talk" call. Before I could get that sentence out, the rushed voice on the other line broke it off with me. I felt Brian's stomach turn in disbelief. When I hung up, he sat with me in silence as my heart started to break. Not just for me, but for this innocent being inside of me. I was at a loss of what to say. But that's the beauty about our relationship. It doesn't require words. I awoke to a card placed by the front door. Inside was a handwritten letter telling me that we make a great team. He offered to help me raise this child if I was worried about doing it on my own. My God, there are thousands of men who refuse to take responsibility for their own children, and here was one offering that to a child that wasn't his? Ultimately, I made the hardest decision of my life to end the pregnancy. When I told Brian, he said, "I love you. Whatever you need from me, I am here." He kept up his end of the bargain a few weeks later, driving and sitting with me in the clinic all day. In one of the darkest moments of my life, I experienced sincere and honest love for the first time. Through the laughter, blistering feet, burning calves, and torrential downpour, I would go on to proudly complete the Big D marathon with Brian by my side every mile. I knew he was proud of me as we tightly hugged with tears streaming down both of our faces as I crossed that finish line. This wasn't just my victory, it was ours. He is my best friend, my soulmate, the Harry to my Sally. We know each other's secrets, keeping them hidden under lock and key. He's the voice I carry with me throughout the day, reminding me that I am not alone and that I am loved. Our relationship isn't traditional. It defies the status quo that men and women can't be friends. Our love is truly simple and unconditional, free of expectations or boundaries. For the first time in my 34 years of living, my soul has finally found a resting spot. My pod is complete with him as my pea. It may not be forever, but for right here and right now, it's more than enough.